Hello, I'm Matt Carpenter, and this is the Good Life Podcast. Hello, welcome to the Good Life Podcast. I am Matt Carpenter, and I am joined today by Dr. Harry Poe. Dr. Poe is the Charles Colson Professor of Faith and Culture at Union University, and he is a scholar in several areas. But I'm especially excited today to talk about a man who is often neglected or mistreated in the literary world, one that almost all of you probably had to read a little bit in high school with some negative explanation from a teacher. That is Edgar Allan Poe. So, Dr. Poe, thank you for joining us, and thank you for coming to talk about someone who is a great figure but often misunderstood. So, thank you for being here today.
Thank you. I appreciate being asked.
So, to begin with, some people will notice your last name. That could elicit a question or two about your relationship, your familial relationship with Edgar Allan Poe. So tell us, how are you connected with him?
He was my great-great-grandfather's cousin.
Okay. Now, originally, he's from Virginia. Is that correct?
Yes, he was raised in Virginia, spent 20 years of his life in Richmond, and the Edgar Allan Poe Museum is in Richmond. It's the largest collection of items related to Poe, includes his personal property, first editions, letters and manuscripts, locks of his hair, piece of his coffin. All of it's there in Richmond.
And they say that we're not one as Protestants who like, slivers of things like that. We certainly do, while just not attributing the miraculous to them, though.
Yeah.
So now you've written a book on Edgar Allan Poe, which I very much enjoyed, called Evermore. And of course, you've also written other articles about him as well. So, in addition to the family connection, what is it that drew you to study more of him? Because I know from your background that he is not what you focused on in your initial academic pursuits.
No, he's not. And I always thought he was interesting. I think I read all of his works when I was in the 8th grade. So I've always thought he was interesting. But in 1999, I was asked to join the board of the Poe Museum in Richmond. And they soon after that elected me the president. So for 10 years, I served as the president of the Poe Museum. And during that time, in my academic work, I was heavily involved and continue to be in science and religion. In that conversation, and a colleague and I, a chemistry colleague, and I've done 4 books on science and faith. So it was a huge interest of mine when I realized that Poe's 1848 essay, Eureka, it's 150 pages, is actually a discussion of the relationship between the physical and the spiritual universe. And that got me interested in Poe. What exactly was he doing? And I realized that Poe was on a spiritual journey himself. He was asking some deep questions, trying to understand, is there a God? And if there is a God, what kind of God exists? And that culminated in the book Eureka, in which he proposed the Big Bang Theory. He proposed what we now call chaos theory. He proposed the basic elements of what we call the theory of relativity. He proposed the basic understanding of the atom, its subatomic parts, the idea of attraction and repulsion. Um, and on and on and on. Some of the major scientific ideas of the 20th century, Poe proposed in 1848. And for his proposal, he was called mad. They thought he was insane. And literary critics up into the mid 1950s were still calling his ideas an indication that he must have been insane, because
Right.
those ideas were not generally accepted until after 1950.
Hmm.
So it was fascinating to me then, from my perspective as a theologian, but also as a pastor, um, that Poe was grappling with personal questions. And so, for my interest in apologetics and evangelism, it helped me think through what are the questions that non believers are asking. We often, as theologians and pastors, present to the world what we think they should be asking, but that's not necessarily the deep question. So Poe was very helpful. And someone that I have worked on uh, professionally as a theologian is C.S. Lewis. And what struck me was that Lewis and Poe were asking many of the same questions
Hmm.
in their lead up to faith, almost tracking one another.
Wow. Oh, that makes me happy on one hand, but also, of course, very sad on the other, just because of how things ended for Poe, which we will get to, in a little bit. But when I was taught, I had to read some of his stories in ninth grade and in 11th grade,
Mm-hmm.
and I received the same type of teaching that I think is pretty standard. Also, is similar to that in college. People have a negative view of him. For one, the things that people read are usually his, his kind of I'd say horror. It's not horror, like modern horror is today, but it's certainly it speaks to something deeper than just mystery. So before I get myself tangled up in the description here, a lot of people have a generally negative view of him.
Mm-hmm.
They think of him as either someone who is just attracted to melancholy, or someone who had a generally depressed personality, someone who's an alcoholic. I've heard it said that he was a drug addict. Where did all of that come from?
Well,
As how did he gain that reputation?
Poe's biggest mistake in life was dying before his biggest enemy. Rufus Griswold hated Poe, was terribly jealous of him. Rufus Griswold is not exactly a name that's on everyone's lips. He's largely forgotten. He did not achieve great literary success, but the one thing he did was write Poe's obituary. And then he edited Poe's works and wrote the standard biography of Poe. And in so doing, Griswold created the myth of Edgar Allan Poe as this madman howling at the moon, in a drug crazed stupor, staggering through the streets of New York. And Poe was alcoholic, um, but if you're um, alcoholic, you can't write. I mean, if you're in a drunken state, you can't write. And so, for the most part, Poe controlled his bouts. Um, if he did get drunk, he passed out. He could not. He had an extreme sensitivity to alcohol, so that he couldn't go on long bouts. James Russell Lowell said that so much as a thimbleful of alcohol would render Poe completely insensible and unable to function. And so so none of his stories were written under the influence of alcohol. He lived in several different cities: Richmond, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. He was born in Boston. He didn't live there very long, but he had doctors in the major cities where he lived: Richmond, Philadelphia, and New York, and all of them testified that Poe did not take drugs, that he wasn't um, uh, in any way involved in that uh, uh, lifestyle, but he was alcoholic, and alcoholism has run in my family for 250 years that we can document. I'm
Hmm.
assuming it goes back long before that, so there's a predisposition to it. So there was that, but it was largely Griswold, and Griswold is the one who introduced um, the idea of reading an author's work biographically, so that the um, uh, so that the story is really about the author. Now, that's a kind of literary criticism that C.S. Lewis despised.
Right.
Um, the effort to read into the story the author when it's a work of fiction, and Lewis wrote it was involved in a literary controversy that was published as the Personal Heresy, in which Lewis said this kind of scholarship is not scholarship and has no legitimacy to it. But
Hmm.
Griswold is the one who really popularized it with his treatment of Poe.
That is regrettable. Uh, Taking a very Freudian view before Freud popularized it and
Yeah.
took it beyond, just literature.
And the
But
interesting thing about Poe is in terms of his personality, um, uh, Poe didn't care for horror stories.
hmm,
Horror stories for him that were just full of gratuitous violence, not much plot, not much meaning. They would build and build with intensity, and then blood and gore all over the street, and heads rolling down the road, and that sort of thing. And he just didn't care for it, but it was very popular in England and the United States in the early 1800s. Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women, wrote horror stories under an assumed name because they sold. The magazines would just devour these kinds of stories. And so
that's interesting.
Poe, who was trying to earn his living as a writer, realized he had to write some of those. And what distinguishes Poe from the scores and scores of other writers and their ghastly horror stories is that Poe's are very well done. And we associate Poe with horror stories because the high school textbooks that anthologize all the literature of the United States are their primary function is to make money,
Right.
and so what they do, they always publish the shortest of Poe's short stories because they take up less space and cost less to include. And so his shortest short story is The Telltale Heart.
Yes.
And
Ninth grade.
his his shortest stories tended to be the horror stories because he wanted to go on and get it done and get it out of the way.
Sure.
So we tend to associate Poe with the horror stories. But he did have a huge influence on the development of horror in the United States. Over 250 attempts have been made to turn Poe into a movie. So over
Hmm.
250 Poe movies, all of which are just terrible.
Right.
And the only one who really understood Poe from a movie perspective was Alfred Hitchcock. Now, Hitchcock never attempted to film a Poe story, but he was governed by Poe's philosophy of storytelling.
Hmm.
And Hitchcock said, what I really wanted to do was what Edgar Allan Poe did. He would tell a totally improbable story, but make you believe it could happen to you on a Tuesday afternoon.
Yes.
And
Yes.
if you'll notice, Hitchcock, um, in a movie like Psycho, doesn't actually show you anything. He suggests it. And no
Right.
one is killed on the screen in Psycho, but
Right.
people are killed. And it's suggested, and the audience's imagination fills in the blank. And if you look at Poe, um, uh, though there is death and mayhem in his horror stories, for the most part it happens off stage,
Right.
like a Greek drama, and it's all suggested and it's all horrible because he doesn't describe it. Instead, he leaves it to the reader's imagination. So the person that thinks that Poe is really, really horrible um, is saying something about their own imagination,
Right.
what
Well,
they picture.
yes. It reminds me, one of my favorite ghost story writers is M.R. James. And he does that with the British ghost story.
Hmm.
You never actually come in direct contact in his writing with the creatures that he presents. You come into contact. I mean, it's a glimpse here. It's a passing shadow there. You will see afterwards what those creatures do. Usually, if someone is prying too far into things that they should not. But anyway, so that's just, it reminds me of James and a lot of the best Victorian and Edwardian ghost story writers as well.
Yes, and so you do have the horror stories. He didn't write many of them. He wrote 75 short stories. His favorite kind of short story comprise a third of his corpus. So one third of his 75 stories are his favorite kind of story, which is a comedy.
Hmm.
We don't think of Poe as a comedy writer because
No.
most people don't read all of his works. They just read the anthology in high school. But a third of his short stories are comedies. He loved a romantic comedy.
Hmm.
His best comedies are the romantic comedies. Some of his comedies are um, satires that depend on what was going on in the United States at that day, and so they don't have the same lasting flavor as uh, his romantic comedies. Um, then after that, he loved science fiction. It was a brand new kind of story invented by Mary Shelley in 1817 when she wrote Frankenstein. But Poe wrote, goodness, I think about a dozen science fiction stories. And then after that, he created the mystery story. So
Hmm.
we wouldn't have nighttime television in the United States without Edgar Allan Poe. He actually created the mystery story and all the basic plots of the mystery story. So um, those were the sorts of things he was interested in.
So we've talked about his the different varieties, genres of fiction. You've talked about your interest and your study of C.S. Lewis and of course Edgar Allan Poe. What is it that made Poe such a good fiction writer?
Hmm. Well, what makes anyone good at what they do? What makes the Wizard of Omaha the best stock picker in the United States? What makes Einstein such a brilliant physicist? Um, and it is that they are particularly gifted at their craft and work at it. And so um, Poe was meticulous, and he would constantly refine and rewrite and work on what he was doing to improve it. He was self consciously aware that he could do better. Most of us aren't. Most of us are more slipdash, and most of us resent criticism. Poe got in trouble in the United States because before he was known as a poet and a short story writer, he was known as a literary critic. And the stories that were being produced in the United States in those days were just dreadful, just sludge. And wanted better American work. Poe was a big proponent of America. America first. We don't need to be dependent on Europe. We'll create our own culture. We don't have to mimic the Europeans. We don't have to ape the English. So he's fiercely loyal to the United States, a lover of George Washington, and his grandfather was a general in the Revolution and had known Washington and Lafayette. So he's fiercely American. So he thought, I appreciate it when somebody shows me what's wrong with my work, so everybody would. And so he would just trash um, the work of other people, including Longfellow. Um, and as a result, he made many enemies. But what's going on there is his own self-criticism. His criticism of others is a reflection of his self-criticism toward improvement. And most of us don't want to do that. That's too painful for most of us. But he was brilliant. I mean, he just was brilliant. To create an entire new form of storytelling is a matter of brilliance.
Right. Yes. And it sounds like his perfectionist tendencies aided him uh, quite a bit as well
Mm-hmm.
in this. So, but he was also, in addition to writing, I mean, you mentioned his literary criticism and fiction, he was also a poet.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your book, you talk about the purpose behind his poetry. And that's one of the things that I honestly don't see a lot of, is at least in many poets, is having a clear and coherent philosophy to what they are doing. And in fact, some of the what he wrote in his poetry, I'm not saying it's not exactly the same, but it reminds me of some of the later Southern agrarians
Mm-hmm.
as far as their view of poetry needing to communicate beauty. So just talk to us about go ahead.
Okay, yes. Well, now, Poe had strong opinions about poetry and about art in general. He said that poetry is the rhythmical creation of beauty, the rhythmical creation of beauty. It doesn't necessarily have to rhyme, but it does necessarily have to have a beat. And he speculated that its origins um, were quite primitive, and the very idea of drums and the rhythm that we find in drums is associated with the beating of the human heart.
Hmm.
It was a speculation, and we can't know for sure, but we do know we can speculate that um, percussions predated other kind of musical instruments, so that rhythm was a part of it. And Poe regarded music as the highest form of art, and that poetry is a secondary, but is a child of music, um, putting words to music and creating uh, words with music. So he was conscious of making the words fit the meter. And so some poets will make a 3-syllable word try to fit into one beat,
Right. Right.
or
Sound like Scottish
they'll
Psalter
they'll
writers.
stretch a 1-syllable word off to several beats,
Yes.
and it's not natural. It's forced. And so Poe said, you need to read a poem with the ear.
Hmm.
Um, and it's supposed to sound a certain way. Now, all of that disappeared in the 20th century with T.S. Eliot and The Wasteland, and new ways of writing poetry in which poetry became disembodied. That is, it lost its meter as well as its rhyme.
Right.
Now it's just Rorschach ideas, or phrases. Um, Sometimes it's prose rather than poetry. And so in the 20th century, poetry is like the canary in the coal mine, where they used to take a bird down into the mines because the bird was sensitive to any noxious gases and it would die before the miners did. And they knew if the bird keeled over dead, they needed to get out of the mine quickly. Well, that's
Right.
essentially what poetry did for us in the 20th century. It told us that our culture was collapsing, and virtually all the art forms did in the 20th century. But Poe was anticipating that, and he took a real strong line about the importance of attending to the meter, the rhythm of poetry, um, as the rhythmical creation of beauty. And he also believed that art in general had as its purpose to create an effect in the audience.
Yes.
So a painting was supposed to have an effect on the person who looked at it. Music was supposed to have an effect on the people who listened to it. A short story was supposed to have an effect on the person who read it. And so this is part of Poe's success. He said from the very first word, you need to be anticipating the ending. What effect are you trying to create? And you can see that in The Fall of the House of Usher. His very
Yes.
first sentence begins to create the mood that gets the climax at the end, and
Right.
and so his poetry does the same thing. Of course, his most famous one is The Raven, and
Yes.
The Raven is one of the most perfectly written poems because we're familiar with the idea that poetry will often move the word order around of a sentence, the logical word order. And in English, we usually think of the subject, the verb, the direct object. There's a certain order. We can move it around to a certain extent. It becomes more stylistic. But in poetry, there's a tendency to move phrases around in order to make them fit the rhythm, and to also uh, uh, chop words up so that you don't have the full word. We make a contraction out of a word that does not normally have a contraction, and you stretch words out and squeeze them in. Poe doesn't do that at all in The Raven, except one spot in the very middle. And I've always thought Poe couldn't Poe just could not stick a joke into something. He just could not leave it alone without having one little joke in his most horrible horror stories and in his poetry. He just couldn't not tell a joke. And so um, in the middle of the poem, there's a reference to the window lattice. And then he says, let me see what their at is. and and that's the one spot at which he changes the word order around, and it slaps you in the face. It's just so discontinuous from what he had been doing. And the remarkable thing is, you can read The Raven as prose. That is its standard sentence structure, and yet it has the rhythm all the way through it.
Yes.
And rhyming, multiple rhyme schemes, very complicated rhyme scheme. Um, and it was an immediate sensation. It made him famous. It was reprinted in newspapers and magazines all over the country, and continued to appear immediately in school anthologies on elocution, and back when children were taught to read out loud and to speak, and The Raven was a standard. So highly successful. Literary critics have long condemned it, and wherever I go in the world and I pull out my credit card to a clerk, they look at the name and they say, "Oh, like Edgar Allan, quote The Raven, nevermore."
Right.
And it happens all over the English speaking world, which is fascinating to me.
One of the quotes that I had to copy out myself from your portion on beauty, because there are, I mean, it really grabbed me when it comes to his view on beauty and poetry, is that beauty, you say, beauty is not neutral brute fact. It causes something to happen within
Hmm.
a person. It's the
Hmm.
kind of universal spiritual experience that Rudolph Otto names the numinous. The striking element, of course, is the connection between a work of art and the person who perceives it. It is not like a morsel of food and the animal looking for something to eat. The animal seizes the food, but the work of art, beauty, seizes the audience.
Yes. It's what C.S. Lewis, in his essay, The Abolition of Man,
Yes.
refers to as the sublime.
Yes.
That is, it actually elicits from the viewer a response. And it's why people are struck by awe by a sunset or a waterfall or a mountain view. They are that what they're looking at is sublime. It is drawing from them a response. That's what Poe was concerned with. It's what C.S. Lewis was concerned with.
Yes. Those parallels are amazing between those two men.
And what they both had in common, um, their mothers died when they were
Mm.
children. Poe was just 2 when his parents died. Lewis was 9 when his mother died. Lewis tells us that that was the beginning of his atheism. And what they were both asking is a question common to humans at all places and all times. If there's a good, all powerful, loving God, then why did he let this bad thing happen to my mother? It's called the problem of suffering, the problem of evil, the problem of pain. Both of them were asking that question. And so you have in Poe those episodes of people doing terrible things to one another. And in Poe, you find natural disasters like the maelstrom, the whirlpool that drags people down, or the earthquake in The Fall of the House of Usher, or the pandemic in King Pest and Mask of the Red Death, or the uh, was it an asteroid or was it a comet that strikes the Earth and destroys all life on it? Um, so he has natural disaster as well as human evil, and everybody asks that question. But where Poe and Lewis went beyond, they asked the rest of the questions. Why is there beauty? Why is there love?
Hmm.
Why is there a sense of right and wrong, or justice? And finally, why is there something rather than nothing? And so they were asking those deep, profound questions. You know, in the atheist corner, you can ask, well, why, if God's there, why does he let bad things happen? And most people just leave it at that.
Right.
If they went on and asked the harder questions, well, if there's only brute matter, how do you explain values, which is C.S. Lewis's argument for the existence of God in mere Christianity?
Right.
And that's what Poe was doing with his poetry. The matter of right and wrong, it's what he was doing when he created the mystery story. Because here's the problem with the mystery story. And remember, Poe doesn't graphically describe the horror in the horror story, but he does. But also in the mystery story, he requires that the audience bring to the story the sense of right and wrong.
Yes.
Some things are wrong, and the mystery story only works when the audience brings that sense to the story, and the audience has to care. They have to care who did it. They have to care about the truth. They have to care that the innocent person be set free and the evildoer caught and punished. They have to care that society be protected from more wrongdoing. They have to care about the truth. And all of
Right.
these are values. They are not material brute matter. In a universe of brute matter, where there's just the physical, there is no right and wrong. There's just what is. Nothing is beautiful or ugly. It just is. And so both Poe and Lewis were struck by these ideas, and it led both of them to theism.
Hmm.
And Lewis lived long enough to become a Christian a year or so after. It would have been a year and about 10 months after he believed in God. Now Poe wrote Eureka in 1848. In August of 1849, he went forward in a Sons of Temperance revival meeting.
Yes.
Now, we don't know exactly what happened. We do know about the Sons of Temperance. We do know about those um, kind of public meetings they had. It's the precursor to Alcoholics Anonymous, in which part of the cure is acknowledging an ultimate being, a higher being. We don't know what religious content there was to it, but we do know that by 1848, with Eureka, Poe's conclusion about all his scientific observations was, therefore, God exists. God is the one who created the universe. God is the one who judges it in the end. Um, but Poe died in the fall of 1849. He did not write anything after he went forward in the Sons of Temperance revival meeting. He died about 6 weeks later.
Hmm.
Lewis, who became a Christian in late September, early October of 1931, would live for 32 more years and do all of his important work after he became a Christian. So you've got that those differences between the two
Right.
men.
And Lewis had a circle of friends
Mm-hmm.
that were consistently pointing him and challenging him in Trinitarian Orthodox Christianity,
Exactly.
whereas we don't, at least from what I've seen, there was not a circle of solid Christian friends that Edgar Allan Poe had.
No.
So, of course, with his desire to start that the American literary magazine, there was possibilities there, but again, in God's providence, that did not happen.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the themes in some of his writing, though, again, it's often overlooked because of our fascination with mystery, with and even horror, is his love of nature
Mm-hmm.
and how that with displays beauty.
Hmm.
And so talk about his love of nature and how that directs us towards the sublime, towards the beautiful.
Hmm. Well, he did love nature. He When he was a boy, his foster father took him to London for 5 years, and there he bought for him a brass telescope to view the stars. And the person he studied with during those years, the Reverend Dr. John Bransby, was a Cambridge graduate, a classic scholar who was also interested in astronomy. So we'll see a lifelong love Poe had of the heavens. The psalmist says, "The heavens declare the glory of the Lord." And so the sublime was hitting Poe at every level, at the cosmic level with the heavens, but also when he was at the University of Virginia, he, as a late teenager, um, he would take long walks, and by long walks I mean 10 and 15 miles, and they're in the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Hmm.
And if you've never seen the Blue Ridge Mountains, they are sublime.
Yes.
They
Yes.
and Every season, right now the rhododendron are beginning to bloom, and the wild azaleas and all the wildflowers. So he had that, but in the fall, they're this covered with color, and those mountains are covered with little streams and waterfalls, and so he would had a lifelong love of these long walks in the country. The same as C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, at the same time in his life, developed this love of taking 10-mile walks because he just had this deep love of nature, and so it was having an effect on him that would wind up having an effect on how both of them wrote and what they wrote about. Um, it's that case of experiencing the sublime. They knew it wasn't a psychological projection out of themselves onto
Right.
nature. Rather, it was an effect on them by nature, which is more than a physical effect, it's a spiritual effect. And that there's something behind the nature, the idea that God is, there's a creator, there's an artist behind the nature. Poe would say, in a lengthy essay on American drama, how bad it was. He said, the plots are just terrible. And then he discussed nature and the mutual dependency and interaction of nature, one thing upon another. And he said, the universe is a plot of God. The universe is the perfect plot. The universe is a plot of God. And he wrote that in, I think, 1844, 5 years before he died. So he was working on this understanding of God all through the 1840s.
Hmm.
Um, but it definitely, that idea that the reason the universe is sublime is because it is a work of art, and art creates an effect in the viewer, and
Yes.
therefore there must be an artist. If you have a work of art that creates an effect in the viewer, there must be an artist who created with the intention of causing an effect. That would be the logic of the argument. And you'd find C.S. Lewis and Dorothy L. Sayers, by the way, also making that strong argument. Sayers did it in The Mind of the Maker, the idea
Yes.
that God is an artist.
Well, and his view that, I mean, he believed in truth, but in one of his essays, I think there was an essay, and I don't have it listed whether it's an essay or a series of essays called "The Poetic Principle."
Yes.
He said that truth is not enough to draw people. but beauty must also accompany it. That is a powerful argument that I would say many in the church right now still miss, especially those of us who are on the strong evangelical side. We think if we just hit the world with truth, they're going to love us for it. And truth is great, but as a professor of faith and culture, and having written about this, I mean, you obviously have an appreciation for the need for beauty to accompany truth, and that's something that Poe talks about as well.
Well, yes, and you have to decide. Well, now who invented beauty in the first place? I think it was God.
Right?
God invented beauty. We didn't. It's and here's the thing about truth. Whereas God is the author of truth, Satan is the corrupter of truth. And you'll recall that Satan in the Bible almost always, if not always, I'm trying to think of an exception, but all the examples I can think of, Satan comes to us quoting scripture, which is true, but you take it out of context and you wrongly divide the word of truth. And so truth can be more difficult to receive than beauty, which is immediate, unfiltered, and has a direct connection. So it does work differently than truth, but God gave us both.
Yes. And as a culture declines, you can see that displayed in the degradation of beauty in that
Yeah,
culture.
yes, in his science fiction novel Paralandra, C.S. Lewis has the demonic figure in that story destroying beautiful things, like these little animals, these little
Yes.
creatures that are so beautiful. It's like pulling the wings off a butterfly just for the malice of hurting. And the degradation of beauty, just as Satan can twist the truth, there's our culture has a tendency to degrade beauty, but in its immediate form, it's a gift from God.
Yes. And so there's any number of things that we could talk about, and I know our time's getting short. So we you have a chapter on, well, I don't remember what the name was. I nicknamed it the Four Loves of Edgar Allan Poe, riffing off of C.S. Lewis's view about love.
Mhm.
But he does talk about love in his works, and you talk about him as a mystery writer as well. But as he, in his work Eureka, what is, I mean, it's I've taken a brief look at it, and I will confess, I said I want to understand this, but I'm going to have to devote more time
Mhm.
to this because it's not light reading.
No.
But his general point in this essay is, from what I've read in your book, it's an emphasis of his that God, as you said, does exist as displayed in natural revelation. Is that a fair summary,
Yeah,
or
yes, in many ways, it's an argument from the existence of God from uh, nature as it exists. That it is a plot, carefully contrived, and all the pieces have to fit together perfectly for it to exist at all. Um, and that would be what we now call chaos theory. The odd thing about chaos theory is it's anti chaos,
right,
it's
right,
more about order. Um, but all the different pieces of the what physicists now call the theory of everything. How does all the different aspects of nature fit together? Would be a theory of everything, and science is still struggling to fit all the different pieces because different scientific theories don't quite fit together, and so they have to be modified. And that's what Poe was doing, all of them at the same time.
Hmm.
Um, but the idea of an expanding universe that's going to come to an end was considered ludicrous in Poe's day because the science of the day was based on Aristotle's view that the universe is eternal in duration. It has always existed and always will exist. And um, infinite in size. It goes on and never has no limits to it. And the only contradiction from that would be from the Bible. But people kept the Bible on Sunday and did science the rest of the week. And Poe was saying, no, Bible's right on this one. The universe had a beginning and it's going to have an end. And that's essentially the Big Bang Theory, but with a scientific basis. Um, and so, why did he do it? What is the purpose of um, the creation of the universe if you're going to bring it to an end? And bringing it to an end is part of the plan. And so he's thinking through all of these things. He hasn't resolved all the theological issues. He's not a Christian at the end of Eureka. He believes there's a God, but it's a vague sort of a God, the same sort of a God C.S. Lewis believed in before he became a Christian. He's not one that meddles in your affairs, you know, and maybe he's everywhere. Well, the Holy Spirit is everywhere, so he didn't have it all sorted out.
Right, right.
Um, but he knew that the heavens declare the glory of the Lord.
Yes.
That part he had.
Well, this is really, I mean, I, I hesitate to use a cliche, mind blowing, but much of it is that a man would propose things that were not known for a long time, which speaks to his own brilliance. But I want to end with the last question on a different note. You've referenced C.S. Lewis several times. The way I actually came to discover you was a footnote to a discovery you made about C.S. Lewis as a spy. I mean, working for the British Secret Service. So as we close, last question, could you just tell us that story and how
Well,
you discovered that? Because this is not a small thing.
yeah, Lewis was not actually a spy. This was an article I wrote for Christianity Today. And authors write the articles, but editors write the headlines.
Right.
And so they put the headline, C.S. Lewis was a spy.
Yes.
He wasn't. But during World War II, what we now call MI5, the Secret Intelligence Service, what James Bond worked for, um, was involved in a lot of different things. One thing they set up was the Joint Broadcasting Committee, whose responsibility was to broadcast to the nations under captivity by Hitler. Well, Britain, the same day Germany invaded Holland, Britain invaded Iceland. We don't usually think of that or remember it, but the British, that Germany had already taken over Denmark. Iceland, so many miles away from Denmark, was part of the Danish Empire. Iceland and Greenland, these frozen northern outposts of civilization, were part of the Danish Empire. And once Denmark was controlled by Germany, then soon the Germans would go to Iceland and take it over and use it as a naval base and an air base. halfway across the Atlantic Ocean, which would make the convoys for the British just totally impossible. The war would be over. So Britain invaded, and the British wanted to, try to do something to make the Icelanders not resentful of having been invaded and conquered by the English, and say, we're really not your enemies, we're your friends. And so one thing they did, they asked C.S. Lewis to broadcast a talk to the people of Iceland, and he had a broadcast that was recorded on 78 RPM records, 2 discs, 4 sides, and the title of it was "The Norse Spirit in English Literature." It was never published, never transcribed, never known by any C.S. Lewis scholars. I found it on eBay. An old bookshop in Reykjavik, Iceland, had acquired it along with some other things, and just put it for sale on eBay. And I said, "There's no broadcast by C.S. Lewis about the Norse spirit in English literature," but I thought it was worth the $10 to find out what on
Sure.
earth is that. And sure enough, it's the first broadcast Lewis made. It was before his radio broadcast that became Mere Christianity. And he begins by saying he's doing this because he owes a debt to the Norse people, because his own imagination was sparked by the Norse mythology when he was a boy. And he gives testimony to that. And that's what really was one of the first steps toward his conversion. But anyway, it was fascinating to hit upon a discovery like that.
Yes. So everyone keep an eye out on eBay for anything that might show up from Iceland
Right.
regarding that. You never know.
You never
So,
know.
well, Dr. Poe, thank you so much for taking time today. It has been so interesting, and it's helpful as we read Edgar Allan Poe to not just see him as an interesting / weird writer, but to see him as someone who is on a path, who's an excellent writer, but also one who is on a path, and hopefully, by God's grace, we can at least know that there was opportunity for him. We don't know what happened in those last few weeks, but that there was opportunity. So thank you again for taking time to talk. It's been wonderful.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
The Good Life podcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might enjoy one of our other podcasts, Got a Minute, featuring Larson Hicks and Rich Luss. Theology, philosophy, economics, politics, and more for normal people.